Hello, YouTube. Yep, it worked. Good. It's time for the weekly Processespod. And I'm going to do some drawing, but I think I'm going to prattle on a little bit briefly about the nature of creativity. This came up, so if you haven't been around, I've talked in the past on this channel about the fact that I am aphantasic, which means that I don't have a mind's eye. It's something I've always known about myself since I was a kid. It just means that when I close my eyes and think about things, there are no pictures or sensory constructs associated with that. I don't see things in my head. But you're an artist. Yes, I know. It's not really an issue. Explaining that will get off topic. There are other videos where I've talked about this. But aphantasia was recently identified medically. Like, there were people talking about it in philosophy going way back. I didn't know about this until recently. But about 10 years ago, it was identified medically when a fellow had a heart surgery. And when he woke up, he found that he could not visualize anymore. And they put him in an fMRI machine and discovered that when they asked him to think about things like a classic test for aphantasia is close your eyes and imagine a beach or an apple. What color is the apple? What color is the sunset on the beach? How rich is it? Is it in full color? Da, 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 everything. And there is a range. Some people have black and white visualizations. Some people have black and white visualizations. Other people have really rich visual lives. But at the extreme end of the spectrum, there are both spectrums. So there's hypervisualizers, the super rich ones, and at the other end, there is aphantasia, and that means that when I close my eyes and imagine an apple, I can think about an apple. I can think about things like color and texture as concepts, but I see nothing. There is no color in front of me. I am just seeing the blackness of the inside of my eyelids. That was something I always wondered about as a kid, because I grew up around New Age circles, and there's always talk about visualization, and I meditated, which works for me, but I don't visualize or get into all that stuff. And I wondered how literal people were, and I've found out since that they were being literal, and I'm just a little odd that way. We're a minority. It's, to be fair, like the extremes of hypervisualization and aphantasia are both minorities. We're both small segments of the population. The vast majority of people somewhere in the middle. And when aphantasia was named and published about 10 years ago, and in the conversations that have happened since, a lot of the people in the media, and unfortunately even members of the scientific community doing the research, frequently couch it as an absence of imagination. And that's just wrong. It's in the name. A as in not. Phantasia is fantasy. And that's a poor framing, because it isn't the absence of imagination. It's the absence of sensory emulating mental constructs, which I'm making a point of saying it that way because this is a turn of phrase that I came across. I stumbled into, invented recently. And when I posted about it on a aphantasia support group, and about some griping about how it's annoying that it's been framed as an absence of imagination. And I think that's very distressing for people who discover they have aphantasia, because they immediately assume they have no imagination or no creativity as a result. And the thing is, it's funny, because as an artist, I've heard that from people, regardless if they have aphantasia, for decades. People will see my work and go, oh, I wish I could do art. I'm useless. I can't do a thing. Or, etc. Some variation on that. There are a lot of people who feel that they're not creative or have no imagination, and it's not even a question of whether they have mental imagery or not. So I was posting just to make the point that I prefer this turn of phrase. I think it's generally would be good for the community to push for more recognition of the fact that aphantasia isn't an absence of imagination or creativity. It's an absence of sensory emulating mental constructs. In my case, and in many cases, it's also not just visual. I don't smell smells that aren't here, taste things that aren't in my mouth, feel things that aren't around, hear sounds that aren't around. I don't get earworms, which is an upside, because I can think about a song, but I can't hear it unless I'm hearing it. So most of the people in the community were like, yes, that's great. And I think that kind of framing will be useful. It doesn't have to be my particular approach, but things like that. But one person who identified later as autistic posted basically, I'm different. And they talked about how they can draw, which was interesting. But then people compliment them, say they're very creative, they feel like a fraud. And they later walked back the comment about being a fraud. But I think they're basically expressing on that level an element of imposter syndrome, which is a very common experience for creatives and almost anybody who does skilled or creative work. If you ever manage to get in recognition for your work or an opportunity to do that work in a professional way, and you ever end up working around other people who are functioning at a high level of skill as well, it's invariable that you will begin to feel like you're inadequate somehow. This is called imposter syndrome. It's also when people give you compliments and you don't feel like you've earned it. In the case of this autistic person, I'm not going to name anyone or anything, but they talked about how so they totally said that they lack imagination. They have the opposite of what I was talking about, how I clearly have an imagination. I can write stories and draw them. And the image you're seeing to the is that your left, my right, is from a story that I did that I posted some samples of in the group just to sort of to make a point, which is this is a comic I didn't even use reference for. I've posted a video. You look in my channel, how I draw a horse displayed Aphantasia. And that one I emphasize the fact that I can use reference and ground my study of the horse in reality, and made a point of talking about how, in fact, visualizers do the same thing. Horses are very challenging. Everyone who's drawing at some point uses reference. If you've never drawn a horse before, and then you're not going to draw one well the first time, you need to study them. And if you don't have the fortune of having a real one in front of you to draw, then, well, you're going to look at reference material. And reference is really just a supplement for life study. It's a form of life study. And I will lean back on reference to draw things that I'm not familiar with, that I've never seen, or that I want to be very authoritatively, precisely accurate. But I've also drawn for 30 years, and there's a lot of things that I've now internalized and learned how to do without reference as well. The same way most people learn how to do handwriting without having to think of or look at how letters are formed. They can just now generate the letters and words. So the story you're seeing, the art from here, that's an 8-page story I've done in which I've used no reference at all, because nothing in that story represented work that's beyond my current skill set or that I'm unfamiliar with. So while I talked in that video about drawing a horse, that there's no shame in leaning on reference material when you need it. The trick is not to be slavish and dogmatic about following the reference. Use it as information and then play with that. Improvise, be open to making your own impressions of it, not being slavish to the source material. I usually put the reference material away at some point when I use it because I don't want it to correct me as I'm going through the process of finalizing my rendering. I want my voice to end up percolating through the process. And I usually use multiple sources of reference. So if I'm looking at a horse, for that study in the video I used one, but when I was doing Dracula, Son of the Dragon, there was a lot of horses, and I would pull up 5 or 6 images of horses at varying angles that were similar to the one I wanted and synthesize that information to derive the image that I wanted to generate. And that's a good way to avoid reference making your work stiff and lifeless. And that's the big worry. That's the real issue. It's not cheating, but it is a pitfall if you use a lot of reference to end up becoming a little bookended by it. So that's worth mentioning. But when you've done enough studying and you've drawn enough, at times you get to put away the reference because, oh, I've done this before and I've done that before, and these things don't even exist. I can kind of make them up. I'm basing them on things I've seen before, but I don't need reference. So for a good chunk of my comic work, I'm not needing to lean on that. For a lot of the work I do for prop work in animation right now, I don't need to pull up reference all the time. I do, use it quite a bit because we're doing a period show and there are certain things that need specific reference to look like what they are, and so I pull a reference for that. But there's other things where I don't really need it. The person I was talking to on the Facebook forum was saying, well, they lack imagination and they feel that none of this is true for them. They can draw people, so folks say that they're creative and imaginative, and they feel like a fraud. And when I try to counter that with some insights from experience, they're very insistent about how, no, so what did they say here? I have no imagination and problem to think about things. I'm just blank. So like saying, create something right now. Think of a thing to be creative right this second. Do it. I'm being a little bit satirical, but I'm familiar with that experience where someone says, even for things like, what's your favorite X, Y, or Z? I usually draw a blank. I can come up with something, but I need to sit on it and think about it. That's not aphantasia, though. That's not because of aphantasia. And they were talking about how, they can create stuff, draw things, but are unable to generate things they've never seen before. And somehow that means they're not creative. And this really kind of stuck in my head, and I was thinking about it for a while. And I wrote a response to them, and I thought I would synthesize and regurgitate some of that here. This is a common misnomer. Creativity is not the ability to invent something that's never been seen before. In fact, that's not a human ability. We don't do that. When you're born, you're the closest thing that we ever come in our lives to a blank slate. And that's why we lay there going, and we have some innate instinctive abilities. One of them is intense curiosity to learn and language acquisition. But we start off with nothing in there. And then as we age and grow, we start acquiring information and learning and experiencing the world and taking things in and seeing things. And if you think about it, in 20 years, it takes to become a full-fledged legal adult in most places, somewhere in the ballpark of between 19 and 22, depending where you are. You've seen a lot, especially these days with access to media and everything. And you've probably forgotten, consciously speaking, most of it. It's in there somewhere. It's become part of the accumulative you, but you've seen a lot. And it's that well of experience that we tap on to become creative. And by become, I don't mean like that's what it takes to become creative. You already are creative. So one of the things I said in the forum, and I will reiterate here, one of my favorite ironies, and I've even done a comic story about this once, the misplaced wordless story you'll find in my book Revolver 1. It requires imagination to imagine you don't have an imagination. Because imagination is simply the ability to conceptualize things. And in order to conceive of a concept that you don't actually have any concepts in your head, you've conceived the concept. And therefore have imagined that you don't have an imagination. There's a beautiful bit of psychology studies that probably most people watching this are familiar with, so you'll immediately know about when I start describing it. It's become exercises now we do to specifically address what I'm talking about. People's self-perception, self-limiting ideas about their creativity. They'll get a group of people, sit down, and they say, so here's a brick. Imagine as many things as you can to do with the brick. And people averaged, I think it was something like around 20 or so things, something like that. I think very good. Now, we want you to imagine yourself as someone more creative. And they would give them various roles to play: artist, musician, architect, scientist, engineer. I thought it was really funny. I think I read in one where they were saying sometimes they told them just to be a stone person. But just, imagine yourself in the role of someone who you perceive as creative. Now do it again. And people without fail doubled the number of things they could imagine doing with the brick, simply by role-playing themselves as being more imaginative. And what does that tell you? That tells you that your capacity to be imaginative is only limited by the permission to be imaginative you give yourself. And that is true for all human beings. And so the person I was talking to in the forum was like, well, no, I'm autistic, and it's a product of this. And they were talking about it in the context of aphantasia, so I think they were making the argument it was a byproduct of aphantasia. It's not. Here's the thing. Aphantasia is definitely connected to some specific set of neurological phenomenon. Things aren't connecting the way they do with people who can visualize. Autism is also connected to a host of neurological phenomena. Neither of them is probably localized into like one switch that we can just, and it'll change things. But they are clear mechanistic differences, which is why we qualify as neurodivergent. I'm neurodivergent both by having aphantasia, I also have dyslexia, I have what I usually refer colloquially as a mild transient anomia. Anomia is something that happens when people have a stroke and they're unable to come up with names. This hits me in passing waves, and typically with people's names, but also other proper nouns of things. And a lot of people say, yeah, me too at parties. Like, no, this is like I will forget my girlfriend's name or my mother's name. Not my second wife. That'd be bad. And it doesn't usually last. It comes back to me, but I've looked at my mother and blanked and not been able to think of what's that person's name again. It'll come to me, but my brain doesn't quite connect in that department sometimes. And you listen to me talking, it's like very high functioning. Yeah, it's just proper nouns. Everything else usually comes to me when I need it. These are all particular neural mechanisms. Creativity is more of an emergent phenomenon like consciousness itself. It's not something driven by a particular neurological phenomenon. So being neurodivergent will not in itself intrinsically limit creativity. You might feel like it, and if you're autistic, you're probably also do you find it difficult to change and adapt. I don't want to couch it the wrong way. Just like we're talking about this creativity thing being a byproduct that came up as a subject as a bad framing of aphantasia. I think that some of the issues around autism are also equally frequently poorly framed. So to be careful here, I was saying that it's not that you can't or you're inflexible, but autistic people frequently find it difficult to adapt to new situations. And so that also will include a reluctance to or difficulty with new ideas. So in psychology, they talk a lot about things like scripts, stories people tell themselves, narratives, self-narrative. And if you always tell yourself that I have no imagination or I am not creative, you're essentially affirming this belief to yourself and creating the obstacle that will get in your way to do the thing. Now, it's not just as simple as, well, forget that, you are creative, go do it. But it also kind of is. Like, the problem is it's hard to accept that change in paradigm, especially if you're reluctant to accept change. But even if someone's really flexible, it's still difficult. There is energy and actual energy being used, but resistance. If you've strongly ingrained a new idea, so the common meme in neurology and psychology, neurons that fire together wire together, and that's how we learn things better, become more facile at a skill, and also ingrain thoughts and knowledge. And if you've ingrained this idea that you are not creative, you are not imaginative, trying to get someone to change that idea means getting those neurons not to fire together, to set a new set of neural patterns that fire together, and then do it over and over and over and over. And that's going to be hard. So it's not just easy, but it is actually simple. It's a simple conceptual framework that you need to change your position and point of view on. And accept that what you are is someone who's bought the idea that creativity is defined by these following concepts that are very common. You must be able to invent things that have never been seen before. You must be able to be creative on demand without framework or prompts or seeds or any kind of jumping off point. Just bang, here you go. Here's an empty room. Go be creative. That you must somehow have these gifts at birth and that they are not acquired through skill, that you can enhance or do things with training, but that ultimately it's somehow innate, intrinsic. And that, I think, that's good enough. Let's stick to the 3. I could probably keep going, but that's good. First one, bullshit. No one ever invents things of whole cloth that have never been seen before. No one, unless you had an accident and something fell on the floor and did something weird and, reality broke. I've never seen 6 dimensions in a piece of pottery before. Well, then, okay. But every single person like folks will go, oh, Van Gogh. Well, no, actually, Van Gogh, first of all, evolved. If you look at his body of work from when he was younger to when he started doing the colorful, beautiful things that he's well known for, there is a clear progression where he took traditional ideas about how to do things and slowly shifted in another direction. He was also building off of a period in Impressionism where we went from the Romance era where everyone hid their brush strokes and you wanted to create paintings that were so technically polished that you couldn't see how they'd been painted, that you couldn't find the brush strokes without a magnifying glass. But in fact, if you go to those old Romance era paintings up close with a magnifying glass, you actually can see the brush strokes. And the interesting thing is that when you zoom into paintings like that, on something that's kind of interesting and textural, what you see is a pattern of brush strokes. It's actually not dissimilar to what we see in Van Gogh. What he did was contrast the colors in a way that makes them pop against each other and make those strokes big and visible. Did not hide them, wanted to show them. They were part of his signature, his handiwork, his hand in the craft. And along with other aspects of the work at the time, it was part of this move in modern art towards the artist's identity, and not meant in a negative sense, but ego being more present on the canvas. And everything he did, while innovative and even difficult to sell at first, didn't come out of an empty void. It didn't manifest magically out of the ether with no connection to past work. It would strongly influence what had gone before. And this is true for every single thing humans have done. Our immense complex society today is the byproduct of building on the work of past generations. And it is getting faster and faster because there are more and more of us, and there's so much to build on. And we use technology now to help us. But all of that creative activity is a product of a system that is preloaded generations of cultural legacy and ideas that we can then pick up on and build upon. And that is myth number one to creativity. Nothing happens in a void, and no one innovates to the point that they create something that's never been seen before. Even though we see that hyperbole used to complement things that are innovative and amazing, it's bullshit. It's hyperbole. And it really gets in a lot of people's way because they feel like they can't do this thing they've never seen before, so somehow they're insufficient. Bullshit. Don't buy it. That's a script you're telling yourself. It'll get your way. Change the script. Second one, that you must be creative in a void. It's very directly connected to the last thing I said, without prompts or whatever. So someone demands you to innovate something on the spot. It doesn't have to be. So, and the difference being here that, this doesn't have to be about something that is wholly original, but even just generate, like, show me your work, do a thing right now, dance, monkey. Not how creativity works. The vast majority of us need something to spark the sequence. So this story that you're seeing the art for is a great example, and I used it in my initial post talking about how aphantasia is not an absence of creativity. This came about because early on in March, during the beginning of the pandemic, my wife and I were in a lineup for a pharmacy, and people were very twitchy. And I joked with her about how, man, you don't want to sneeze around this crowd. Everyone thinks you're going to explode or something. And that sparked in my head a set of thoughts. No sensory emulating mental constructs were involved. Just ideas, abstract ideas. But the abstract ideas formed a story. And the story was about an artistic couple, like my wife and I, who come out of this warehouse apartment with this interesting mural on the door that we'll find out later on is meant to scare away unwanted strangers. But why would it scare anyone away other than looking intense and kind of weird and a little bit scary? Well, we find out it's a wordless story. We follow them through this landscape of a world experiencing some futuristic, crazy, I imagine, aliens pandemic, a spore-like thing that infects people. And you see the way it's changed the world. There are protesters and militaristic police and lines to get into stores and things. And eventually they come to a pharmacy to queue up. And there's a guy inside getting kicked out because he refuses to wear a mask. And there are exchanges, and he bumps into the couple and then gets a few feet away and sneezes. And everyone just holds their breath. And then he explodes. Spoilers. He explodes into what looks kind of like a rapidly expanding rose bush. I'm imagining there's some sort of like spore-based thing. And flowers that also spew out black clouds of more spores. That all came to me in about 5 minutes waiting in line to get into a pharmacy during a pandemic. None of it was pictures. It was all narrative. It was initially just sort of emotional concepts. It was seeded by a joke I made with my wife. It's definitely not invented a whole cloth. It's informed by all kinds of past experience with science fiction, and I have a lot of experience writing and telling stories now. I teach how to do that, so I definitely know both intentional processes, and I have a lot of experience just sort of doing it, improvising on the spot. But it didn't just happen because someone did it at me. I said a thing, and it set off a chain reaction of thoughts in my head, and it gave rise to something that I went home and did a few sketches for, and then started drawing a story in my spare time. That's creativity. That's creativity for everyone. I'm not bragging about it. This is the process for everybody. Let me demystify it for you if you aren't aware. People have a nugget of an idea. Sometimes it's internally generated. Sometimes it's externally presented. But it's always a seed, a nugget. And then you start adding things. And you pair and cut and shape and rearrange, but that's creativity. It's synthesis. Not spontaneous creation out of nothing, but the synthesis of ideas into something. And if you just point at someone and say, do it now, they're going to almost always be frozen in the moment for a bit. Doesn't matter if you're artistic or not, because there are so many things to choose from. I think there are certain people who can pull it off. And a lot of that, in my experience, as an art teacher and a creative around lots of other creatives, the folks that you can just point at and they're ready to go. First of all, they've been practicing improvisational creativity for a while. They've probably done improv classes or something like that. But even if they're not that, they're the kind of person who'll be good at it. And that usually means they have a racing mind. It's full of things all the time happening. And you're just giving them an excuse to direct that spigot of endless stuff at something. But even them, sometimes they'll point at them and they'll still go like, because they'll be frozen by inability to choose which thing to go with, even if it's for a few minutes. For someone who's told themselves that inhibition, that moment, or I should say inhibited feeling. I can't say the word right now that I want. This is the anomia thing kicking in. But the inability to just do it on the spot confirms this notion to themselves that they have a limit, a lack, a shortfall. And so it becomes more cemented. And the next time someone asks it, they become even more dug in. I can't do that. That's not a thing I do. I know that that's me on one level, singing and other kinds of performative things. I developed, after having a really bad theater teacher, I developed a bit of stage fright. And then I could get up in front of a group and not feel anxious. But if I started talking, I'd realize shortly after that I was sweating profusely. I've gotten better at it. Being a teacher really helped. But for a long time, I was very inhibited that's the word I was trying to say, on performative presentation. And when I was in my 20s, if someone asked me to do it, I would just, the script in my head was that that's not a thing I do. And I had to trick myself into it via the small group presentation, which is essentially a performance of being a teacher in a classroom. And that's the thing. You can change those scripts. All these narratives, these myths we tell ourselves that define the personality we believe ourselves to be, can also become boundaries on the person we have the potential to be. It doesn't mean that you can do anything in the world. There are real-world limits. If you have autism, for example, there are real-world bounds that puts on your ability to adapt to certain situations and accomplish certain goals. But creativity isn't one of them. Again, it is an emergent compound process, not a neurological trait. Like consciousness, the only limit on creativity is unconsciousness. What was the third thing I mentioned? I forget now. I think I maybe have covered it already in my meandering, rambling, unscripted babblings here. But that's 30 minutes, so maybe I should just cut it at that. We'll make this a little rant about the nature of creativity. If you want to be more creative and you feel like you aren't, the trick is to, first of all, change the script. Understand that, bowerbirds, those are the birds that make really colorful nests to attract mates. Radically different brain. Wouldn't call them stupid. They have very complex brains, but radically different brain, totally neurologically different than us. Like neurodivergent, this is something else entirely different. And yet they can make unique, complex, ornate, many people say, beautiful nests, and no two are the same. If they can be creative with that simple emergent behavior, then there's nothing short of unconsciousness that will keep you from being creative. So change that script. And then understand that it is a synthesis. So feed the fire. Look for things that inspire you. And start keeping notes for ideas and don't dismiss them. If it helps you to write them down, as it does for me, because I'm not good at remembering specific things for long periods of time. So I have a number of notebooks. My current very active one, a little red book. And I write down my ideas, my notion about the pandemic story. Initially, the first thing I did was write down a point form little narrative outline. And then let it settle, let it brew. Don't expect spontaneous on-the-spot mastery of everything all the time. You're not going to be good at everything the first time you try it. So also need to acquire craft. If you want to be an artist, you're not uncreative if you don't yet have the skill to render to the satisfactory level that you would like to be. You need to go develop those skills. That's not creativity, that's skill. And then you take the synthesis of those ideas and those skills you've acquired and you generate. It's all very process-based. Hence the name of this podcast, the thing right here, Processespod. That's what it's about. Art is process. And there are some artists who don't like to think about process, like to just be kind of unconscious and in the moment. That's fine. But for a lot of people, it's a crucial part of the creative process, is to be aware of your process, have structure and direction, and be aware of the parts and be aware of the gaps and what you need to fill in, things you need to train, things you need to get better at. Do you not have a good way of keeping your ideas for later use? That's something to address. Get a nice notebook. Just download an app, something. I don't trust apps because data can get destroyed. But so can books. I just like the physicality of a book. But don't keep telling yourself, I can't blank. There are certainly things that would fit that bill. Like, it's definitely a tall order to ask a blind person to be a great colorist. Not just a painter, but a colorist. It's not impossible. There are people who've done it. They usually use some sort of technical aid. One of the things I think is really interesting is there's a couple of these blind, not sculptors, woodworkers. A lot of them seem to like using as well a lathe, which blows my mind because those things are dangerous. But it's not really a total limit. But yes, difficult. There is a serious hindrance involved there. And yet there are people who do it. So don't tell yourself just because you feel unable, that you experience imposter syndrome, that you're not creative. Change that script. Tell yourself that you need to work on your creative process. It's underdeveloped. You got to believe that it wasn't a thing that was attainable to you, and with some time and effort now you're learning to be more creative. And remind yourself that just the concept, just the thinking that you're not creative is an act of creation. Every time you put a sentence together and speak it aloud, it's an act of creation. You've taken knowledge of words and phonemes and constructed a sentence. Yeah, it's not super impressive because you've taken it for granted, but it's a creative act. And with that, I'm going to end this live stream, set up my drawing tablet, and start a new one for just drawing. So go be creative, and I'll see you again on the channel shortly.